So this right here is the DJI FPV drone. It's nearly 3 years old, and the question I'm going to be answering today is it worth buying in 2023? So let's get into it. So to answer the question of is it worth buying in 2023, I'm going to be comparing the DJI FPV to a series of traditional FPV drones, and I'm going to be going through the advantages and disadvantages of each drone. So the DJI FPV has a number of features that make it very appealing to beginners. Number one being ease of use. The drone works out of the box, there's no hassle. You don't have to do any real setup. All you have to do is connect the goggles and controller together. The app basically walks you through how to do every bit of it, and it's very easy to use overall. So in the category of ease of use, the DJI FPV absolutely comes out on top. The next appealing feature of this drone is of course its position hold and return to home. The DJI FPV with its integrated GPS and compass is able to hold its position extremely accurately down to about a meter. This feature is not possible on FPV drones running Betaflight. The only way to achieve position hold on an FPV drone is to run a piece of firmware called iNav, which can be quite complicated to set up when compared to Betaflight and often has a lot less flight features compared to the likes of Betaflight. However, just recently Betaflight 4.4 has just been released, and it comes with a new update to return to home, meaning the drones are much more accurate compared to previous generations of Betaflight. The return to home was more of a I'll get you back and you take over and land type thing, as opposed to coming and landing at your feet. However, with 4.4 it is much more reliable, and the drone will normally land within a couple of feet of your takeoff position, and this is pretty impressive as Betaflight does not use the compass, meaning that it is relying totally on GPS. The second thing it has going for it is its flight time. This drone, despite its weight, can fly for upwards of 12 minutes, which is very impressive for an FPV drone, and compared to the likes of a 5-inch that will fly for typically 3 to 5 minutes, this is pretty impressive. So if you know anything about the DJI FPV, you know it probably gets a lot of hate, particularly from the FPV community, but also from people online, people who haven't flown FPV before, saying it doesn't fly well.
The rest of my life gonna start today.
Can't get good footage from it. Camera quality's bad. I just like to say that, to be honest, this is a load of nonsense. If you know how to fly this drone and you know how to edit footage, you can get some really good results. I've used this drone on commercial shoots, flying for fun, I've sent it off cliffs, I've done pretty much every type of flying possible with this drone, and after using this for 2.5 years, I've got some pretty incredible footage. While the new Mavics, such as the DJI Mini 3, the Mini 3 Pro and the Mavic 3 offer the ability to shoot incredible footage out of camera, I think the DJI FPV, while it can do this, if you give it the right lighting, you still need to manipulate the footage in post to get good results. It's just like anything. To get the most out of any camera or drone, you need to be editing your footage in post. So one of the things with this drone that people complain about quite a lot is the stabilization. The drone uses DJI's rock steady stabilization algorithm, but compared to gyro stabilization through programs such as GyroFlow and RealSteady, you can get much smoother results with your footage. Now, the advantage of running a GoPro is not that the GoPro stabilization is better, it's simply that GoPro give us access to the gyro data inside the footage, so we can use programs such as GyroFlow, which are external and not affiliated with GoPro. And these programs allow us to get smoother results by post-stabilizing our footage. And so what I would argue is if we got access to the gyro data in the DJI FPV and we're able to smooth the footage like you can do with the Avata, you get some really nice footage from this. An interesting thing I noticed is when the Avata came out, there was a lot of footage that looked like it wasn't really suitable for a cineloop. Like there was mountain diving shots, there was big wide surfing shots that were suitable for this guy, but we've been shown on the Avata and everybody thought, oh, the Avata's better, it's got better stabilization. It doesn't, it just gives us access to gyro data, which we again put into third-party software called GyroFlow or into GoPro's RealSteady, and we then stabilize that footage, and that's how you get that smoother result. But that's not to say that you can't get good footage at all from this thing. So as we don't get access to the gyro data, any jitters or jumps are going to be a bit more noticeable in the footage. That's not to mean you can't get good footage from this thing, you just have to fly a lot smarter. So if you're going for cinematic FPV shots, typical sort of flying off cliffs, flying in beautiful places like this behind me here, where you're just going for sort of big, long, wide cruising shots, the best way to fly this drone is slow and smooth. And to be honest, that's how you should fly any cinematic FPV drones. Even with GoPros, you still need to be smooth on the sticks to get good results. So what a lot of people do with the DJI FPV, including myself, they'll take a full-size GoPro, such as this GoPro 11 here, and they'll mount it on top of the drone on these 3D printed mounts that you can either buy online or print yourself. And while you may think, oh, this is the ultimate solution, I can mount the GoPro on, I can get my higher quality stabilized footage from the GoPro and my reliable return to home from the DJI FPV. Yes, it works to a degree, but the drone flies very badly. It's not made to carry the weight of this, so if you already think the DJI FPV doesn't fly very well, then think of just adding a big brick on top of it and then trying to fly. That's pretty much what it's like if you're flying a full-size GoPro 9, 10 or 11. Now you can mount a GoPro 8 onto this drone, and that's typically what I did. When I did fly this thing with a GoPro on top, I would have mounted the GoPro 8, and it was just a little bit lighter. The drone was still heavy now, don't get me wrong, but it flew much better compared to the GoPro 11. I found when you put the likes of an 11 or a 10 on, the flight time was just too much reduced and the jumping quality wasn't really worth it for the reduction in flight time. But there is a way of being able to get GoPro stabilized footage on top of the DJI FPV with no reduction in flight time or performance. And it's got something to do with this little XT30 plug out the back of the quad here. So this right here is the naked GoPro 11. It is a stripped down version of the full-size GoPro 11. It weighs only 25 grams. It has all the features the normal GoPro has, apart from the screen, of course, on the back. The screen is obviously removed and it's placed into this little plastic casing to keep the weight down. It does still have the front-facing screen, however, so you are able to see what you're doing, and you can still pair it to the app on the phone to be able to control the settings and preview the feed. So the naked GoPro 11 is the perfect solution for the DJI FPV. You can get full quality, stabilized GoPro footage on the drone without having any real effect on flight time with its weight. So what's the catch? Well, the catch is naked GoPros need power and they don't use batteries. So there's only two ways of powering a naked GoPro on the DJI FPV. One way is to mount a small little 2 or 4S battery onto the drone, but there's no real point in that because you're just adding more weight onto the drone and it's bringing it back up to the weight of a full-size GoPro, so you just may as well run a full-size GoPro that's fully built up and has a battery built in. So the second way is to power it from the drone directly, and you're probably wondering how do you do that? Because this part does involve a bit of DIYing. I wouldn't recommend it if you don't know what you're doing. DJI are definitely not going to recommend it. It's definitely going to invalidate your warranty. What you can do is pop off the back casing here, and underneath this housing is where the ESC is located, and that's where you plug the XT60 from the drone's batteries into. Just above that port is 2 battery pads. There is a bat and a ground pad, and what you can do is solder on a little XT30 connector here, and those 2 pads will feed the voltage from the battery directly. So you may be wondering, is that going to fry my naked GoPro? If you're using the nameless RC naked GoPro kit, it comes with a built-in deck that's rated up to 6S. The DJI FPV uses 6S Lions, so it is getting fed 6S voltage. However, the deck inside the nameless RC naked GoPro kits can take this voltage and step it down to what's needed for the GoPro. So as you can see here, this is the DJI FPV with the naked GoPro mounted on top. It's much lighter. It basically weighs nothing. You can't really tell it's on here. And as you can see on the back of the naked GoPro, I have the XT30 port that is soldered onto the drone. Then I have the other end of that, the XT30 connector that goes into a tiny 3-pin JST plug and then into the naked GoPro directly. So all I have to do to power this thing up is literally just to plug these 2 things in, just like so, and that just sits there. I made the plug short enough that it's not capable of falling into the props and getting cut up. And just like that, you've basically got a naked GoPro on the drone, powered and ready to go. So in my opinion, if you are going to go down the GoPro route on top of this drone, this is the way to do it. So let's look at some example footage from the naked GoPro. Let's go. So the big question of should you buy the DJI FPV in 2023? Well, I think the first thing to note is that you shouldn't compare the DJI FPV to the likes of the Avata. They're 2 completely different types of drones meant for 2 different purposes. The DJI FPV is best suited for big wide cruising shots, say at mountains, by the coast, anything where you want to cover a good bit of ground. Compared to the likes of the Avata is better suited for close proximity flying, indoors, in and around people, anything where you're flying close to objects and you could potentially crash. So probably the biggest thing with the DJI FPV drone is that it is not a freestyle drone. DJI have always made camera drones focused on getting high quality cinematic footage. This thing is not meant for bando bashing, it's not meant for freestyling, it's made for getting footage. So if you're a freestyle pilot slaughtering this thing online saying it doesn't fly as good as your 1950 kV Apex bando basher, then obviously this is not the drone for you. It's not a drone that you take to the bando to try and hit as many gaps as possible with. It's just not made for that. Another thing with the DJI FPV is that of summer 2023, it is actually cheaper than a typical 5-inch FPV drone setup with DJI O3 in it. The DJI FPV is now priced at around £779 with the DJI goggles V2 and the remote controller V2. At that price, it's a pretty unbelievable deal when you look at it. You're getting a bind and fly digital FPV drone that works out of the box with no issues. It has the best video transmission on the market with the DJI O3 transmission. It comes with a set of high quality digital goggles and a controller that all work out of the box with pretty minimal setup. A typical 5-inch FPV drone setup with the DJI O3, controller, batteries, chargers, everything you need to get flying is going to cost you anything up to £1,000, probably starting from around £1,000. So from a value point of view, the DJI FPV definitely wins hands down. Now moving on to some direct comparisons between the DJI FPV and typical FPV drone sizes. The first one we're going to compare is a 5-inch FPV drone. And between these two, there are definitely some advantages and disadvantages of both. For the DJI FPV, one of its main advantages over the likes of a 5-inch is going to be its flight time. This guy will typically fly for between 8 to 12 minutes, compared to around 3 to 5 minutes on average for a typical 5-inch drone. Now you can fly for a bit longer with one of these guys, but you're sort of getting up to the weight of the DJI FPV. So the advantage of these guys being more agile kind of becomes redundant when you start adding bigger batteries to try and match the flight time of the DJI FPV. Longer flight times with the DJI FPV allow you to fly longer distances and cover more ground than you could with a 5-inch. You definitely have to be much more conservative with your battery with a 5-inch. And typically when I'm scoping out spots with a 5-inch, I'm looking for sort of close mid-range proximity spots where I can sort of fly out and I'm not going to be worried too much about my battery. So in the space of flight time, the DJI FPV definitely wins hands down. Of course, the downside of the DJI FPV compared to the 5-inch is of course that this thing is much more heavy and is way less agile than a 5-inch. A 5-inch is able to do flips, rolls, all sorts of tricks, as well as fast flying with pretty much instant power compared to the DJI FPV. The DJI is significantly slower, it can't fly as fast, and it is much less responsive. So if you're primarily looking to get into FPV for maximum performance, definitely go for a 5-inch. So when we start comparing the DJI FPV to a 7-inch FPV drone, the comparison definitely starts to get a little closer, as I kind of think the DJI FPV is more of a sort of 6 to 7-inch FPV cruiser than it is a 5-inch drone. This thing is definitely more of a cinematic cruiser focused on getting cinematic shots primarily. So in that regard, it is very similar to a 7-inch FPV drone. It's primarily made for long range flying and cinematic FPV. So when we start to compare the two, the advantages of the DJI FPV become a little more thin in comparison to the 7-inch. However, there are some advantages that the DJI FPV has over this guy, one of which being the position hold. The good thing about the DJI FPV is when you're flying out to a spot, say you're lining up at a cliff dive, with the 7-inch you've no real way of stopping and sort of scouting out your shot as you're flying. Compared to the DJI FPV, you can literally hit the pause button on this drone or just stop flying and go into normal mode, and this will hold its position and hover really accurately, whilst you can tilt the camera up and down in flight and have a look at your surroundings as you're flying. That's just not possible at all on the 7-inch. You could argue if you run iNav, you can hold your position with a 7-inch, but you can't adjust the FPV camera up and down to be able to see where you're going. That's a feature built into the DJI FPV, and in that regard, the DJI FPV absolutely wins hands down in being able to basically just take a pause mid-flight and have a look around, scout out your shot before getting lined up. So another cool feature of the DJI FPV is actually more of a technical one. It's related to the drone's on-screen display, or OSD. When you're flying the DJI FPV, there is a home point icon that actually updates dynamically in the feed and sits in the image where you are standing. So it makes it much easier to fly back to home compared to when you're using Betaflight OSD on a 7-inch. You do have some of those on-screen display features, such as the home arrow, but with Betaflight it's more of a points you in the rough direction. It's never really exactly accurate, and you're relying more on distance meters, which definitely isn't as accurate as the DJI FPV. However, if you're doing long range, the 7-inch absolutely wins hands down. There's really no comparison. From a flight time point of view, these guys can fly for anything up to half an hour, which is nearly 3 times as long as the DJI FPV. So another advantage of 7-inches is because they're much larger with their 7-inch props and their larger motors, they're able to carry a much heavier payload. You can run one GoPro on the front of your quad and a behind the scenes camera out the back. You can put a little Insta360 Go 2 or a Runcam Thumb, run that on a big metal pole out the back, and the extra weight is absolutely no problem for 7-inch to carry because they're just so much more powerful. Also, if you're using a 7.5-inch frame, the likes of Falcon Rad FPVs, Falcon RPM, that quad can actually carry 2 GoPros, one at the front and one at the back, getting a backwards point of view, which is very cool. And again, this is not possible on the DJI FPV. The thing would fly terribly because it's just not made to carry anything other than its built-in camera. I know I said earlier that the DJI FPV's on-screen display with a dynamic home point was a nice feature. Compared to a 7-inch drone running Betaflight or iNav, there's really no comparison in terms of the amount of OSD elements you can actually get in your goggles as you're flying. The DJI FPV's OSD is definitely very beginner friendly. They just sort of put the stuff that you need to know. They don't put any technical stuff, the likes of amp draw and milliamps consumed, etc. because most people don't need to know that when they're flying. They just want to fly the drone and see a battery percentage, you know, for when they need to come into land. However, when you're flying a custom drone, particularly a 7-inch drone for doing long range, you want to be able to see all of those OSD elements, particularly battery voltage per cell, current draw and milliamps consumed. These are really important for flying long range. And so in that regard, if you're doing any sort of longer range flying where you want to be maximizing your flight time and keeping an eye on all the important elements, you definitely want to go with a 7-inch drone. That's where these things are so much better. So you may be wondering, why am I making this video? This drone is nearly 3 years old and it's nearly the end of 2023. Why on earth would you want to buy one of these things? But I just wanted to come on and say that this drone is definitely not as bad as people make it out. I've owned it since release, and as you've seen throughout this video, I've got some pretty amazing shots of this thing. In my opinion, it absolutely still has a place in the market. If you're looking at buying and fly FPV drone that works out of the box, this thing still wins hands down, even in 2023. There is still no buy and fly 5 or 7-inch FPV drone that works as well as the DJI FPV in terms of getting set up and working with pretty much no hassle. Now, it's not to say it doesn't have some quirks. It's definitely not the best flying FPV drone on the market. But if you're somebody who's thrown the Avata and you're wanting to step up to something a bit bigger, but you don't quite want to veer into the Betaflight world of custom FPV drones, this thing is definitely worth considering picking up. So there you go, that is the end of the video. Thanks for watching. As always, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel. If you're a fellow DJI FPV pilot, drop a comment down below and let me know what you think of it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.